Chapter 3. After school, Althea did not go home. She drove around town in a jealous rage. Street after street passed beneath her tyres like some great black, bleak grid of life. If only Celeste had not said, "Of course!" It was that "of course" that was the knife in the back. A light turned yellow, and in her present mood she wanted to slam down on the accelerator, roar through the intersection, leave a patch on the pavement and fill the faces of bystanders with foul exhaust. But she drove carefully, as she had been taught. Then, like lightning filling the sky with sheets of silver, she remembered something. Celeste was too young to drive, but Althea was not. "I have a license and a car. Why, I'd be happy to drive Celeste home, or to a party, or anywhere else that Celeste might choose. Briefly, anyway, until... well... And of course after that Celeste would be too tired. It wouldn't matter anyhow." "You have cheerleading practice, of course," thought Althea. "Celeste, my friend, I have a car, of course, and a shuttered room, of course, and a vampire." Althea turned left, then right. She gripped the steering wheel like the compass of life. 3 miles and she was back in the school parking lot. Beyond the buildings and the tennis courts, the football team was practicing. Boys were lined up on each side of the field, hurling themselves at each other. From such a distance it was not possible to tell which heavily padded body was which. The school had many L's and additions. Althea circled the building, looking for cheerleading practice. The grass had just been moved, and the air smelled wonderful, like hay and countryside. She remembered the vampire's smell, when he did whatever he did. Would Celeste notice the smell first, or would she? "Stop," thought Althea. "Don't think about the details." Around the next brick wall was a small paved courtyard, and there they were, all 12 of them. Mrs. Roundman, their coach, was not pleased. "Not even half trying," she was shouting. "Not one of you. You are all lazy. What is cheerleading, an activity for melted marshmallows? You act as if you'd run out of energy spreading peanut butter on Wonder Bread. Call yourself cheerleaders? Ha!" Several girls were close to tears. Several seemed merely irritated, as if they had better things to do than stand around while Miss Roundman had a temper tantrum, and one was amused. Miss Roundman did not miss this. "Celeste," she bellowed, "you think this is a joke, perhaps?" "No," said Celeste, trying to smother her laugh. "Of course not, Mrs. Roundman." Althea caught Celeste's eyes and giggled. Celeste giggled back like a conspirator or a friend. "I should give her another chance," Althea thought. "We could be good friends. I know we could. I can tell by the way she's sharing that giggle with me." "One more chance," said Mrs. Roundman grimly to her squad. "I said every leg is to reach the same height on the kick, and that's what I meant." Quite a few other people were watching practice. 2 squad members' boyfriends were there, leaning against a brick wall, playing cards. A boy Althea did not know was doing his chemistry. His glasses had slid down his nose, and he looked sweet and childish. 3 ninth-grade girls looked at their favourite cheerleaders with open adoration. A little knot of kids were sharing a single soda and monitoring each other's swallows. She would have liked to join the card game, help with the chemistry, sip the soda, even join the 9th graders. But after the first brief glance her way, nobody looked at Althea again. The cheerleaders worked hard. Kimmy Jo had the most style, and Celeste was the most beautiful. But Becky gave off an air of joyful celebration, while the other girls were breathless from exertion. Becky seemed breathless from love of cheerleading. Finally, Mrs. Roundman ended practice and stalked off. Althea did not know what she could be grumpy about. In Althea's eyes, the squad was perfect. Celeste, out of breath and pink-cheeked, dropped to the ground next to Althea. "She's a bear," confided Celeste. This is what friendship is, Althea thought. Somebody telling you something they wouldn't tell anybody else. "I can see. Does she always treat you that way?" "Or worse. Honestly, I don't know where they find these coaches." Althea thought Mrs. Roundman was an excellent coach. Certainly the school had the best cheerleaders Althea had ever seen. But she said sympathetically, "Gosh, you must be tired, Celeste." I'm utterly exhausted. People don't know how difficult cheerleading is. You don't get the credit you deserve. Celeste arched her back like a cat and slowly melted down. A few golden threads of hair across her forehead annoyed her, and she stroked them into place, rotating her long neck to relax herself. She added, "And what's more, I have to wait an hour for a ride home. A whole hour just sitting here, till my parents are out of work and can come for me." What a lovely neck she has, Althea thought. It really is swan-like, just the way they say a high-fashion model should be. What soft white skin she has. Since we're becoming friends, Althea thought, perhaps I'll ask her if she's ever thought about modelling. I've always wanted to be a model myself. We could go into the city together. I am so bored, said Celeste. Althea looked at her uncertainly. Nobody is around, Celeste said. Everybody is left. Not quite everybody, thought Althea. I'm here. Celeste ran beautifully polished fingers through her silken hair. Her nails were pale, pale pink, but they could get paler, Althea thought, and I know somebody who would also think that's a lovely neck. You poor thing, said Althea. Well, I'm heading out right now. Want a ride? Chapter 4. His skin had darkened in patches, like fruit going bad. If she touched it, the skin would feel like a sponge. The fingernails seemed detached. She could pluck them, harvest them, fill a basket with old vampire nails. Althea closed her eyes to block out the sight, and then quickly opened them. It was difficult to breathe evenly in his presence, but she knew that if her breathing were ragged and frightened, he would enjoy it. It would give him power over her. So she regulated her breathing. She blocked out visions of Celeste being touched by the vampire's spongy skin, his foul mould against her swan sweet neck, his smell in her hair. But she had to know. What happened? Said Althea. The vampire looked surprised. You want details? His teeth overhung his lower lip, shimmering like pearls, like Celeste's hair. I don't want details, said Althea hastily. Just, well, an overall picture. With a long, bony finger, the vampire traced his lips as if savouring something. How thin his lips were, how bloodless. Although actually he looked somewhat more healthy than last time Althea had encountered him. Althea felt a little queasy. What could have made him healthy? I did it, she thought. I actually gave a vampire his victim. The air around her thickened. It crawled up her legs and crowded against her spine and her heart and her head. She could not see the air, but she could feel it, all woolly and damp, whispering, That's what you did. You're bad. You are evil, Althea. He straightened her back and stiffened her jaw. I did what I had to do, she thought, and Celeste deserved it, so there. The dark drapery that seemed to be the vampire's clothing shifted and swirled as if it were leaving, but the vampire stood still. The hem of his black cloth blew toward Althea. She stepped back, and the black cloth reached further, trembling eagerly. The vampire collected it back and wrapped it around himself like a container. To Althea he said, It was only necessary for Celeste to enter the path of my control. Once you and she circled the house, she was within my light path. Light? You are dark. You are night. It is in fact a dark path, admitted the vampire. I thought you would better understand a comparison to the rays of the sun. He smiled again, his teeth the only bright thing on earth, those notched glittering fans that Celeste had known. Had it hurt? Had Celeste understood? Had Celeste talked to the vampire? Did she know who had led her into the dark path? Althea looked off to the side. It was dark this early in the morning. Frost sparkled on the ground. The hemlocks and firs were black as night. The moon was still visible. Stars trembled. There was no wind. The world lay quietly in the shadowy circle of the house and the trees. I was able, said the vampire, his voice as wet and muggy as a swamp. To migrate within Celeste's boundaries. To migrate, it sounded like swallows and robins. It sounded rather pretty and graceful, an annual event. She was very relieved. She had thought the word would be puncture or stab or even gnaw. But migration, that was peaceful. Perhaps Celeste had not even noticed. Yesterday Celeste had stayed on to have a Coke, had admired Althea's bedroom, shivered at the spookiness of the shuttered room. When Althea drove Celeste on home, she had chatted about school, about boys and clothes. Celeste had not sounded like a girl caught in a dark path. The black cloth escaped from the vampire's twisted fingernails. Little threads from frayed edge spun towards her, like spider's web, hoping to snag her. The fringe wove itself into more cloth and grew in Althea's direction. Althea said slowly, "Am I in your dark path?" "No. There are some people who are unreachable." He reached me pretty well, thought Althea. I gave him Celeste. What if she knows? What if she says so in school? What if she tells people? "You open the shutters, Althea. You and I, we are evenly matched. We are both in control, and both of us may only go so far. But Celeste, I fear, is in a different category." He did not look as if he feared a thing, or ever had. It was not fear that lined his lips, but hunger. I'm not in control, Althea thought. If I were in control, I would have made myself popular the day high school began. "So, after midnight," said the vampire, his voice wafting past like fragrance, the sound of his pleasure like perfume. "I visited Celeste." Althea looked quickly down at the ground. It swayed, or Althea did. She reached out for something on which to steady herself, but the only object near her was the vampire. She yanked her arm back and shoved both hands in her jean pockets. Then she spread her feet for a firmer stance. She was glad to be wearing a heavy jacket. Maybe they were evenly matched, but a few extra layers of protection would not hurt. She adjusted the collar on her jacket, tucked it under her hair, zipped the fat silvery zipper up to her chin. The vampire laughed, and this time she did not turn her head away fast enough, and she saw his laugh like the curve of the moon, a pale crescent of evil amusement. "What have I done?" she thought, wanting the wind to come up, the sun to rise. The black drapery flew out behind him like bat wings. He pulled the cloth back and went on laughing. Her breath felt stale and used. It seemed to Althea that her own breath was her soul, rising up a sad and lesser thing than it had been. "Dawn is nearly here," murmured the vampire. He gestured with a finger like foil towards the pink beginning of a new day. "Go to school, my dear. It will begin." "What will?" "Being popular, of course. Isn't that what you wanted?" His words were whispery as the wind. His skin, the colour of mushrooms, faded into the dawn, his black drapery vanishing among the hemlocks. The air stayed thick and swampy where he stood. With difficulty she drew a breath. She tasted him and spat the air out, walking backward, covering her mouth until she was near the garden where the air was fresher. In the house she had little appetite for breakfast. You did what you had to do, she told herself. And it wasn't so bad. Celeste was just going to be tired. And you get to be popular. For so many months Althea had entered high school with her eyes lowered, her posture caved in to keep from having to see that nobody saw her. Today she walked in with eyes lowered and posture caved in because, if they do look at me, will they know what I've done? Who it is that I talked to in the dark? What I gave him? "Althea!" cried a girlish, happy voice. Althea spun around as if being attacked. "Althea, I love your hair like that," said Becky, gaily catching up to Althea. "It's all fluffy and kind of, I don't know, sparkly." Becky, the best cheerleader, the one Althea most wanted to be liked by, and to be like. Althea wet her lips with nervousness. "I was just out early this morning," she admitted. The mist probably settled on my hair. Up early? Asked Becky. I'm always up early too. That's so neat to meet somebody else who does that. See, my parents always go for pre-breakfast jog down to the lake and back. Their circuit is 5 miles. Becky beamed joyously. Lots of times I go with them. How demented, Althea thought. Running 5 miles on purpose when you could just be lying in bed? Althea struggled to return Becky's exuberant smile. And why are you up early? Becky asked. Althea tried to think of an explanation, but nothing came to mind. I really like the stars and the night sky, said Althea. It sounded very lame, even more so than jogging 5 miles. She had scarcely noticed that they had been joined by Ryan. She was dumbfounded when Ryan said, No kidding, I took astronomy last year, Althea, and I really got into it. You know that the night sky changes continually, so that the constellation you find in March is not the same as the one in November. You and your constellations, said Becky indulgently. She gave Ryan a friendly poke. He tugged her ponytail back. Althea doesn't care about that, Ryan. I'd like to learn, said Althea. I'm really quite ignorant. I just sort of go outdoors and stare upwards. I don't know anything really. Do you have a telescope? Asked Ryan seriously. It had never crossed Althea's mind to want a telescope. Because that tower room in your attic would be such an excellent location, said Ryan. I mean, you're really in the dark part of town. If he knew how dark, he wouldn't be so eager, Althea thought. No street lights, said Ryan. No lights from all-night car dealerships, nothing to spoil your view of the stars. He smiled at her. He said, I have a telescope you can learn on. He's suggesting that he could come over. Ryan of the football team, at my house. Becky, bored by stars, said, Did you get that algebra, Althea? I thought it was really hard. Althea had forgotten that she and Becky were both in second-year algebra. Of course, they never sat near each other. Becky sat with the other cheerleader named Dusty. Normal people could not have nicknames like Dusty. They would get teased until they actually became dust or lint or other underfoot objects. Only a cheerleader could say out loud with pride, My name's Dusty. Ryan said, I could bring my telescope over. We could put it in the tower room. The tower room, Althea repeated. Her hair prickled. No. She could not ever have anybody in the tower room. The vampire was free, his dark path lit. The one with all the shutters, Ryan explained, as if Althea were not familiar with it. Wouldn't it be neat to have a slumber party in the tower room? Becky cried. Althea could not think. A slumber party? Oh, how she wanted to have a slumber party. A dozen girls all at her house, all laughing and happy and glad to be there. But the tower room. Becky locked arms with Althea. Together they headed for algebra. Ryan trailed after them, talking about telescopes and stars. Far down the hall, Michael waved, smiling. Althea felt her popularity rising on that wave. Becky said, We don't have cheerleading practice today. You want to come over to my house, Althea? Becky plopped down on the first available seat, not her usual seat near Dusty. I mean, first we'll go to McDonald's, of course, and meet everybody. Then we could go over to my house. She yanked Althea down next to her. Becky got a teasing, provocative look on her face. Ryan lives next door, she said, as if making an offering. We could play telescope together. Ryan heaved a great sigh. He had followed them into algebra. Althea was confused. Ryan didn't have algebra. He was a year older. He had trigonometry. Why was he accompanying them here? My telescope, Becky, said Ryan, although he was facing Althea, is not a toy, although I am sure Althea and I can think of plenty of games to play. He winked at Althea. Ryan had winked at her. Michael had waved at her. Becky had sat with her. Althea didn't care what happened to Celeste. She would never care. She winked back at Ryan. You're sick, Ryan, said Becky. Get out of here. You're annoying the algebra class. Go to your silly trig. Ryan grinned. I'm not sick, he told Althea. I'm a very interesting person. So are you coming to McDonald's, Althea? She nodded and he nodded back, and that was heaven. She burned with joy. She felt like a house on fire. When the algebra teacher called on her, She had the right answer, and when Becky made a joke, she had a quick laugh. I'm here, thought Althea. I'm where I deserve to be, among friends. Chapter 5. But before McDonald's came music. Chorus was another high school group that had not turned out the way Althea had expected. She was one of 16 altos. She had not made friends. She yearned to sit between two girls, both of whom would talk to her. Instead, she sat on the end of the row, sticking out into the room, next to one girl who never turned her way. Sitting on the end gave her a good view of the curved sections and the friendships other people had made. I could sit in the middle, she thought, with a popular alto on my left and a cute baritone on my right. She steeled herself. She moved sideways over book bags and shoes. She said to the alto, "Mind if I sit here?" The alto beamed at Althea. "Sure, that'll be a nice change." And Dusty, whose seat it usually was, "Oh, good, I'm sick of being suffocated in the middle of the pack. Thanks, Althea." She sat in the centre, one of the crowd. The laughter and chat wrapped her up like a blanket, hot from the dryer. She giggled with the boy on her right. He said, "I'm really sorry, but I don't know your name." "Althea." "What a neat name. I never heard it before." He smiled. "Althea," he repeated. Before she could ask his name, the music director whacked the top of his stand with his long white stick and, in his martial arts way, began warm-up exercises. How special her voice sounded from the middle. Being an alto wrapped her in companionship. The boy's voice, an octave lower, added a dimension to singing she had never known. For the first time that year, the director met her eye, smiled and nodded at her. She felt like an opera star. The director cut them off. In the silence before he gave more orders, Celeste entered the music room. Her sparkling eyes were dull. Her gold hair was limp. There were 3 steps down because the room was designed for tiers of singers or instrumentalists. Celeste stood at the top. She shifted her load of books to the other side for better balance. Celeste felt her way down 1 step, panted slightly and rested before taking the next step. "You're late," said the music director sharply. "I'm sorry." Celeste looked foddy. "I felt sort of slow today." "I'm not interested in excuses," said the director irritably. "You are late. I do not tolerate lateness." Celeste shuffled down another step. The boy next to Althea muttered, "This is a cheerleader? No wonder we don't win any games." He rolled his eyes as Celeste tried to focus on the final step down. "Want a cane?" he said cruelly. Althea no longer wanted to know the boy's name. She no longer wanted to know her own name. "What have I done?" she thought. Celeste was just supposed to be a little bit tired. She hardly even looked alive. Althea tried to breathe for Celeste, to suck in rich, clear oxygen that would energize her. But Celeste did not breathe deeply. Celeste stumbled and dropped her books. The music director sighed hugely, exaggerating patience with this idiot who could not even cross a room. The girl who took attendance said dryly, "While we're waiting for Celeste, I'll make announcements. Think you can find a soprano section by then?" If that were me, thought Althea, I'd blush scarlet. But Celeste is just shuffling on. Then Althea herself went white as paste. Celeste was not blushing. How could she? To blush, you need blood. Becky laughed with intense excitement, as if she and Althea were going on a grand expedition, instead of just going to McDonald's. Twisting and turning, Becky told every giddy detail of her day. Her black hair was pulled tightly into a ponytail, and with every syllable, every move, seeming every thought, both Becky and her ponytail bounced. Althea tried to concentrate on what Becky was saying, to realise that she was going to McDonald's with the crowd, but she kept seeing Celeste's shoe inching towards the edge of the last step, trying to find the bottom. "Lighten up," Becky commanded her. As if it were orders from a general, Althea obeyed. It was only 2 miles to McDonald's, and yet by the time they were in the parking lot, Althea was younger, happier and noisier. She too bounced out of the car. She too jumped up and down, clapping as Ryan drove in to join them. Ryan had been joined by a boy named Scotty, whom Althea hardly knew. It was a treat to see these two muscular young men get out of Ryan's car. First, Scotty dove over the seat back, landing like a beached whale half on the floor and half on the seat. Then, lumbering to his knees, head thrust forward, he opened the right rear door. This door too had its problems. Scotty emerged very carefully. "Hey!" shouted Ryan, diving over after Scotty. "Don't close that door at all. My face is in the opening." "Oh," said Scotty. "Well, I guess I could wait another second or two, but I'm a fast track kind of guy. I don't like to hang around, Ryan." Ryan slid out. First one long jeans wrap leg, then an arm, a broad chest, a dark and handsome head of hair, and finally the other leg. Althea had intended to daydream of Michael, but now she found herself encompassed by Ryan. Ryan was a weightlifter who talked of how many pounds he could bench press, and he knew all his muscles by name. Everybody had a cheeseburger, except Ryan, who ordered 3 Big Macs. He ate each one in only 4 bites, his teeth dividing each huge burger like a pie. "Well, that's what's new in my life," Becky said, wrapping up a discussion Althea had missed while admiring Ryan's eating habits and muscles. "Althea, your turn to talk. Hold up your end of the conversation. What's new in your life?" Ryan, Becky and Scotty waited. They went on swallowing milkshakes, waiting to hear what was new in her life. "What's new in my life?" Althea thought. "I've gotten to know a vampire quite well. His skin is the colour of mushrooms. I don't know how he gets in touch with me. What do you think of Celeste in her altered state? Do you know what I did to her? This girl with whom you are having a cheeseburger, she hands people over to vampires." Ryan and Scotty frowned slightly. Becky looked irritated. Althea struggled to think of things to talk about. Had anything happened in class, after school? Had she gone shopping, or even cleaned out her room? It seemed to Althea that, except for the vampire, she had no life. Suddenly, to her horror, the vampire was standing there, her throat closed up, her eyes glazed. "He's not here," she thought. "He can't come into a McDonald's. Certainly not in broad daylight. This is not fair. The backyard is one thing, but—" She opened her eyes. He was not there. Her nerves had fabricated him. She breathed again and realised to her shame that the solitary sigh was her only contribution to the conversation around her. Becky giggled. "Well, that was exciting, Althea," she said. "We must chat about this again one day." "Don't pick on her," said Ryan. "You're so mean, Becky." "She's not mean," said Althea quickly. "I'm slow." Ryan took this opportunity to discuss his telescope. Weightlifting was his daytime activity. Stars were his nighttime activity. Scotty took this opportunity to mention several things that normal teenage boys enjoy doing at night, as opposed to something lame and pitiful like studying satellite orbits. "Here's what I say," said Becky. "I say we have a party at Althea's because it's new and we haven't partied there, and I'm sick of all the old places. Ryan can set up his telescope in that tower room whilst we dance on those old big porches." Althea's smile trembled. She had fulfilled her obligation to the vampire. She could do as she pleased, and yet she had not shut the shutters. Was he still there? Where was that dark path exactly? Could he touch other people? Would Becky... Althea's body was rigid, as if her blood had stopped circulating, or had been drained. "I don't know if that would work out, Becky. I mean, I'd love to, but—" All right, Becky said sulkily. "I just think it's somebody else's turn is all. It seems to me the parties are always at my house." "That's because your parents let you do anything all the time, Becky," Ryan said. "Most people's parents never let them do anything." He stuffed his napkins into his cup, stuffed the cup into his burger box, and squashed the whole thing into a remarkably small square. "So what's Celeste's problem?" he said to Becky. Althea's stomach knotted up. This was it. This is where they found out, where they understood, where they caught her. Becky shrugged. She didn't want to talk. She said she was tired. "She stumbled around the school today like a zombie," said Scotty. "She could have at least been polite," said Becky. "Here she is, a 9th grader. Everybody on the squad has been very nice to her, and she couldn't even be bothered to let us in on her problem. I asked her if I could help, and she shrugged. That did it, that shrug. You can't have secrets from your teammates. They don't like it." "Let's not talk about Celeste," said Ryan. let's talk about you." He meant her, Althea. Ryan wanted to talk about Althea. An uncertain, joyous smile began on her lips. Ryan said, "Come on, more, more." He touched her lip corner with his finger and drew the corner up until Althea laughed out loud. Celeste won't be tired long, Althea thought. She'll perk up in a few days. I'm not going to worry. Anyway, it's worth it. Chapter 6. How dark the yard was. Althea had not known such darkness existed in the world. There was not a hint of light, nothing at all that was less than black, and yet she could see where the vampire was and where he wasn't. He was half in the hemlocks. Indeed, he seemed half hemlock. His arms were among the needled branches. His hair might have been growing straight from the trees. "You wanted me?" he said. "How flattering. You want to give a report, perhaps? Tell me, how are things going with your new popularity, perhaps?" "It isn't necessary, my dear. Since I created this popularity, I know exactly how it is going." She had thought he was part of the Shutters, that the tower room was his coffin, but his tomb was the house. But no, he was growing out of the trees, the thick black towering hemlocks. But maybe that was part of it. The trees themselves were also a tower. "I could cut the trees down," she thought. "If I need to, I will cut the trees down." She wondered why she would need to. She had finished her commitment to the vampire. It was over between them. "It was just that she had a complaint to register," she said. "I didn't think Celeste would be that tired." The vampire shrugged. The trees lifted and fell with his shoulders, swishing blackly. "I didn't promise degrees of tiredness," said the vampire. Althea wet her lips, and the vampire, laughing, wet his lips. She put a hand over her heart, and the vampire, laughing, put a hand over his heart. He said, "All the gestures are blood symbols. Did you realize that?" "But you don't deal in symbols," she said. "No." Once more the air thickened around them. The blackness of earth and sky faded to pre-dawn grey, and the grey was so thick that Althea thought she would suffocate, that the human body could not absorb clouds of wool. She panted, struggling for air, and stumbled away from the hemlocks towards the house. The sun rose. The tower of the house cast the first shadow of the day. A shutter flapped where it had come unfastened. It sounded like a soul unhinged. The school had its own video capacity. The first week she attended high school, Althea had been awestruck. To think that if you were a president of a club or the captain of a team, you could literally go on television and announce your meetings and games. What it would feel like to choose your outfit in the morning, knowing that you would be on television for the end of the day announcements. Kimmy Jo had not been captain of varsity cheerleading when Althea was a freshman. A senior named Katia had held that honour. Katia was tall and lean like an Ethiopian princess. She always wore the most astonishing jewellery, and when she was on the TV screen, Althea was overcome with admiration and amazement. This year, Kimmy Jo had made the cheerleaders' announcements. Her approach was markedly different. No exotic Cleopatra on the Nile. Kimmy Jo was a bubblehead whose statements of when the game was, or when the practice was, or where Spirit Day would be, always sounded breathless and questioning, as if Kimmy Jo were not entirely sure and were hoping a really kind football captain would help her out. Really kind football captains always did. TV announcements were a time in which to say terrible things about people's hair or clothing or a degree of nervousness. "It's Kimmy Jo again. Does that girl bring her own hairdresser to school? Oh wow, look at that neat outfit. Kimmy Jo could be a game show assistant right now in those clothes. That would be a good career for Kimmy Jo. Clapping, I think she has it put down pretty well." Althea never made cruel comments. If she were on the school TV, she would probably hide behind the principal rather than face the cameras. She was filled with admiration for kids with nerve enough to be filmed live. She dreamed of being that kind of girl who didn't even bother with notes, but chatted away, perfectly relaxed, as if having fun. This afternoon Miss Roundman came on. She was nicely named. Small, slightly chubby, pink-cheeked, relentlessly energetic. Althea felt that the young Mrs. Santa Claus had probably looked like that, pre-white hair and elves, so to speak. "Good afternoon," Miss Roundman began, her smile vanishing quickly as she became fierce. "We have an unexpected vacancy on the varsity cheerleading. Tryouts will be limited to those girls who tried out in September. Any girl who wishes to try out must commit 4 afternoons a week, plus the game schedule. She must have a C average. All girls planning to try out sign up after school. Any girl who cannot come at the appointed hour, see me today with an appropriate excuse." Mrs. Roundman would never believe an excuse. If you were too busy to try out when Mrs. Roundman wanted tryouts held, you were worthless. Althea's class burst into talk. "Who quit the squad?" they cried. "Who got kicked off, more likely," added someone. "Who was it?" they demanded of Becky. "Celeste," said Becky. "Isn't that weird? She telephoned Mrs. Roundman and said she just didn't have the energy for the season after all. She said it was taking too much out of her." The boys looked doubtful that cheerleading could take that much out of you. The girls looked doubtful that Celeste had ever wanted to be on the squad anyway, and it was her own dumb fault if she ran out of energy. Althea kept her features ignorant of what had actually taken a lot out of Celeste. "I must look sorrowful and concerned," she thought, as she rejoiced. Becky leaned towards Althea, her dark, floppy ponytail quivering. "You should try out," she said. "You almost made it before, you know." Even though she was thrilled at the compliment and the suggestion, Althea was a little bit shocked. Shouldn't Becky show more concern for Celeste? Hadn't they been friends? Shared practices and snacks at full? Althea said uneasily. "Did you talk to Celeste? Maybe she changed her mind." Becky shrugged. "She's a quitter. Who needs a quitter? It's not that kind of squad." The class echoed Becky. "She's a quitter. Who needs a quitter?" She had not quit. Not really. She had been removed. Becky said, "I'll coach you, Althea. You'll be perfect. You're exactly my height and figure too. And Mrs. Roundman is aiming for a better lineup. For example, although Amy's really good, Mrs. Roundman isn't going to take Amy because Amy's too short, and she won't take Brooke because Brooke has to be 7 feet tall if she's an inch." Althea cringed. Brooke was sitting right behind them. But of course Becky, being popular, had not bothered to look around first, because she didn't have to worry about other people's feelings. They had to worry about their own. "I'm 5'11", said Brooke irritably, "and I'm not trying out anyway. I have a full schedule. I'm much too busy to interrupt it for something as bland as cheerleading." Becky and Brooke exchanged several more insults. Then Brooke turned to Althea and smiled generously. "Good luck," she said. "You won't need it, though. You were so good at the tryouts. I couldn't figure out why you didn't make it." The smile caught Althea by surprise. It was so friendly, so honest. "Maybe I will have friends not in cheerleading, as well as my friends on the squad," she thought. "Maybe my life will be packed like Brooke's." Althea smiled tentatively at Brooke. Becky and Althea walked down the halls, past the lockers, through the narrow passage to the coach's offices, and into the girls' gym. Only one bleacher had been pulled out, and on that narrow bleached gold bench sat so few girls. Althea couldn't get over it. Hardly anybody was trying out. "Perhaps," the vampire had said, "I could arrange for the competition to be missing." "Wow," said Becky. "How come nobody's here, Mrs. Roundman?" "Mid-season replacements are problematic," said Mrs. Roundman. "The kind of girl we want is not a girl who sits around with an empty schedule. By now, such a girl has other commitments. She's a busy, active, involved person, or we wouldn't want her on our squad anyway." "I don't have any other commitments," said Althea nervously. Mrs. Roundman hugged her. "I think you knew a spot would open up, Althea," said the coach. "Your commitment to cheering is very strong. I absolutely feel it, Althea." Mrs. Roundman led them through grueling warm-ups that led them outdoors into the same courtyard as before. The sun was not so strong. A slight chill rose up from the grass. Althea swallowed. Becky shouted advice. Mrs. Roundman shouted orders. A dozen kids gathered around to watch. One of them was Celeste. Althea tripped and steadied herself on the brick wall. The brick was slightly warm, as if it was slightly human, like Celeste, who seemed only slightly warm and slightly human. Celeste's face was caved in, like a child sleeping. She did not really cry. She just stared, her mouth sagging as if she could not understand what was happening. "Celeste, I told you to go see the school nurse," said Mrs. Roundman sharply. "What are you doing here?" Celeste mumbled something. She doesn't even have the strength to move her lips, thought Althea. Mrs. Roundman said, "Celeste, you're upsetting everybody. That's very thoughtless of you. You've surrendered your place on the squad, which in my opinion was the action of a quitter. So quit. Go. Leave. Now." Nobody went to help Celeste. Nobody spoke up on her behalf. Nobody leaned down to carry the book bag for her. Celeste could not hoist it from the ground, and instead dragged it over the pavement by a shoulder strap. Only Althea watched her go. Everybody else had better things to do. I knew he would give me popularity, thought Althea, but I didn't know he would give me Celeste's. I didn't know she had to lose everything for me to have something. I thought... Far across the field, the football team was practicing. Ryan and Michael were there. Ryan, who made sure Althea was going to McDonald's. Michael, who was so perfect. Her heart pounded fiercely, nervously, desperately. I have to get on the squad. It's my ticket to Ryan and Michael, to Becky's parties. Out of the sun, in a cold corner, stood 8 girls in junior varsity cheerleading uniforms. Sullenly they watched Althea and her competition. When Mrs. Roundman allowed a brief rest for a sip of water, the JV captain walked over. Her voice was hostile. "I don't understand, Mrs. Robinson," said the JV captain. "Why didn't you just bump one of us up to fill Celeste's seasoned JV cheerleaders available?" Mrs. Roundman frowned slightly. She looked over the grass, and the grass trembled slightly, as if invisible feet were passing by. "You don't have a reason, do you?" said the JV captain, trembling in anger. "You just felt like bypassing the JV squad." Whose feet had just passed by? Who had persuaded Mrs. Roundman? What was out there on the grass? Mrs. Roundman said, "You people are having such a fine season with your own fine coach that I was hesitant to make such a change. There will be more squad changes when football season is over." The JV captain brightened. "This is a temporary addition then, until baseball season? There'll be new tryouts then?" "We'll see how everything works out," said Mrs. Roundman, and the JV squad went away, less hostile. Althea did not like the word temporary, nor the phrase "we'll see." Football season was half over anyhow. Is my popularity already half over too? Thought Althea. Is this all I get? A taste? A few weeks?